Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black, Season 14. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're thrilled today to be joined by Professor J.T. Roane, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Geography and the Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He is also currently the visiting scholar in the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and he joins us today to talk about his important book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, published by New York University Press 2023. We are, in fact, label mates of Dark Agoras. Newly minted MacArthur genius, Imani Perry writes, J.T. Roane brilliantly theorizes Black sociality, sensibility, and spirituality in historical conjecture. Roane uses archival and critical resources beautifully, situating this work firmly in the Black studies tradition while simultaneously making exciting new interventions. Most of all, Dark Agoras is a stunning story of insurgent world making that will have a significant impact on the world of ideas. How are you doing today, Professor Roane?
I'm doing pretty good, Mark. It's good to see you. How
Good
you
to
doing?
see. I'm doing well. This is, as Professor Perry mentions, an amazing book. Talk a little bit about your journey to Dark Agoras.
Thank you so much. I think this book has kind of two origin stories. One is very personal. I think, I had family who moved to Philadelphia. My grandmother went to South Jersey and Philadelphia as a farm worker in the 50s and 60s, and I have a whole wing of family that we didn't reconnect with until the 80s that lived there. And when we met them, they understood Virginia as home. So I thought I think that sparked in some ways a curiosity around what it really means for Black communities in a place like Philadelphia in the industrial metropolis to consider a place in the rural South maybe that they've never even been as their home. And I think the other kind of origin story is really through my encounters with John Paul Hammond. I originated this book and the idea for it in thinking about Black harm reduction politics and thinking about folks who responded to HIV and AIDS and trying to tell a story about the kind of radical care that preceded that within Black life and not just as a kind of condition of post-Stonewall gay politics. And books come together and they fall apart and they come back together again. So that part didn't make the book, but it did shape it in thinking about the kind of antecedents in this kind of radical, sometimes considered out there Black world making.
You begin the book by taking on really the first significant survey of Black American life with Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro. And you double down on some of the things that he might have seen or thought of as unusual or even unsavory. And you really build the idea of Dark Agoras around the kind of set-aside culture or left-aside culture that many within the mainstream of Black life and definitely Black middle-class folks would see as not being unworthy of Blackness. Talk a little bit about the title, right? This idea of a Dark Agora.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do engage Du Bois in thinking about, these kind of worlds that he notices the kind of set apart in the underground, particularly the economic and the sort of social underground that define a city in his study by 1899. And I think I use Dark Agora as a kind of umbrella to hold those two worlds together and to take note of the kinds of transactions, interactions, movement between these two worlds, and the kind of political leverage that it builds within 20th century Black political and social life in Philadelphia. So I think agora is, in the kind of classical Greek sense, the kind of market oriented around the white citizen as opposed to children, women, slaves, and other people in that kind of context. And I think in some ways I'm playing with that formulation to think about these kind of worlds that shadow the kind of mainstream market-oriented spatial organization of 20th century Philly.
I think in many traditional ways, and we've talked about Black urban life, we often talked about it within the context of formal and informal community, formal and informal institutions, formal and informal economies, right? And another sense of it. You lay on top of this the idea of a Black vernacular landscape. Talk a little bit about what your intervention is there by framing Black institutions as vernacular institutions.
Yeah, I think the kind of the set apart and the underground as I take them together are part of for sure the kind of relationship to informal. I think informal often marks a relationship specifically to markets and legality. And I wanted to take up the kind of spatial forms that takes on and really think, I guess, about what those mean as infrastructures of living in the city alternatively. And through place and through the kind of palimpsest that is place, thinking about the ways that various histories come to bear in one neighborhood or in multiple neighborhoods and across neighborhoods in the wider city, and the ways that those shape politics, often again at the edges of what is mainstream institutional life, but not in no way disaggregable, if that's the right way to say that, disaggregable from the kind of mainstream, and especially the kind of leverage points that certain civil rights and Black power organizers have in relation to these spaces and the kind of potential that's viewed within them, but also the kind of the negative potential that some interlocutors view within these spaces.
Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of scholarly language within Black studies that's examined the idea of maroon culture, marronage, usually in an agrarian context. We obviously always have thought about it in a Caribbean context, but increasingly we talk about American maroons. In some ways, what you're laying out with Dark Agoras seems to be an urban version of maroon culture.
Yes, I think so. I think there's a recent book as well by Celeste Winston that just came out. I see this book in such rich conversation with and see such potential in the kind of dialogue with the question of marronage and its kind of movement. I think for sure, Black communities at the kind of edges of plantation life, and sometimes up to full on maroon communities that were separate and relatively isolated from plantation economies and ecologies and geographies. There's a kind of there are Black spatial forms that emerge in that context that don't just give way after the kind of end of the Civil War and that follow Great Migration communities forward. And I think if you follow the kind of impulses of the underground and the set apart in the context of slavery, especially vis-a-vis and in relation to mastery, they're indistinguishable because they're nighttime activities that are unsanctioned, they're illegal, they're punishable by death. So when you get to the city and they're bifurcated, even within Black, vernacular architectures and infrastructures of the neighborhood, they still have these hot points that are really significant. And I think that's about the kind of longer trajectories that place brings into these matters, even in the context of Philly, and the ways that the underground and the set apart do provide for a different ethos and different sets of value, much like maroonage did in the context of slavery and after that.
Talk a little bit about this concept of Dark Agoras as shape-shifting. I immediately think about in my own experience growing up in New York and seeing storefront churches that were one church one day and another church another day, right? And at some point would be a grocery store. And it speaks to the kind of informal ways that people have to navigate economically within these kinds of spaces. But the reality is that at the same time in which there's a surveillance culture, and specifically a police surveillance culture, right? It's important for some of these informal institutions to have the ability to pivot, physically, metaphorically, and otherwise. So talk a little bit about this idea of shape-shifting.
Yeah, I mean, Du Bois and again the Philadelphia Negro sort of points out the impermanence of some of these kind of institutional spaces as part of their detrimental character in a certain kind of way in terms of long-term institutional Black life. But I think and he's very keen about what that might mean within a certain frame vis-a-vis politics as interlocking with the state and with other kind of entities. But I think there is something about this kind of passing and fleeting relation that happens at the edges of kind of social existence, and especially and up through institutional forms like the storefront, um, that begs questions around the capacity for opacity to be
Mhm.
meaningful and useful, for the ability of shape shifting, to take different forms. And then also, I think for me in the work, shape shifting also signifies on the ways that the shared kind of spatial um, formulas between both of those worlds that are often in diametric opposition. So when you get to an organization like Move and recognize that they combine really formulations of place that are associated with both the underground and the set apart, that there's that shapeshifting has multiple meanings itself within how I try to think about it in relation to Dark Agoras.
Yeah, you use this language in describing this kind of shape-shifting process as small scale edits, to matters of place as opposed to, a disruption of social realities. And it made me think on a couple levels. One, whenever we talk about political reality, right? And this is me coming from a literary background, or at least a study of literature. The idea that so much of politics, in insurgent politics, right, is embedded in the content. You're making an argument, because so much of Black studies is almost wholly related to the content of political narratives and political theory, but you're making an argument about form, about the political impact, the political insurgency of cultural form, right, in terms of space as a way to really intervene in the lives of Black folks. Talk a little bit about, respond to that a little bit if you can.
Yeah, I do. I think again, I think that there in the group, I mean in the book, I often deal with groups and formulations of the political future that are not easily dissolved or absorbed
Mhm,
into a kind of
mhm.
formulations for even a future that I might want necessarily. So I think, but I think about following Eula Taylor and other Black feminist historians, especially to think about the ways that even in kind of the imperfect vehicles of often charismatically led, social movements and religious organizations, the ways that if we pay attention to form and we pay attention to matters of place and all the kind of quotidian infrastructures of living in them that make that possible, that there are other things to be said even about organizations that we think we know a lot about. So for example, when the peace mission movement, Father Divine, after a certain point, shifts center from Harlem to Philly in the 1940s, is a charismatic kind of second coming figure. And if we only pay attention to that, we miss the reality that Black women are doing all this world making effort that he then
Mhm,
is resting
mhm,
on top of.
mhm,
And so I
mhm.
wanted, and I think that comes through when we talk about stuff like um, the basic infrastructures of that guide who eats with whom. Those kinds of questions become real significant. And I also think again that widens the kind of political terrain that we can think through and move through in the present, by expanding out, along the kind of contours of the Black radical tradition, who and what is a significant past for thinking the particular nexus of ecocide and herbicide that we live at. So
Yeah, I got to tell you, I was a bit surprised, as I was engaging the book to find Father Divine, in the book, as representative of the work that you're doing. And I wonder, for you, did you go into this project thinking that you would take on Father Divine, or is that something that was literally revealed to you, as you were working through, the story that you were telling with Dark Agora?
Yeah, it's surprising to me, I think, that's where I would come to this. I think again, I would have to go back to some of the original questions animated in the book, thinking about folks who were in the 1990s in Philadelphia engaged in needle exchange and other stuff that didn't make the version of the book that's the final one, but who's, John Paul Hammond, for example, who I was writing about and thinking about in a dissertation, who's helps to found Prevention Point in 91 that is handing out needles and all of that in Philly as a radical harm reduction politics. His father came through the peace mission, was raised in the peace mission. And so I think it raised for me the fact that traditions are ambivalent, that, because John Paul's father fled from the peace mission. He was not, even though he was raised there, he was not, he did not want anything to do with that after a certain point in his life. But then when you hear John Paul couching his kind of radical AIDS politics in peace, and the kind of calls for peace and certain very basic care modalities that we can associate back through groups like the Peace Mission, I think we get different kinds of genealogies. And I think, again, Father Divine and them are not people that I necessarily want to go live with and inhabit with myself. But there is some kind of work that happens, especially through, again, the communion table, through this engagement with feeding people, that exceeds and precedes his power, and that his power is only possible through. And I think in centering that, we get to particularly Black women's work and the kinds of the worlds that Black women are building that this kind of figure takes over in a kind of way. So I think it's that's why it's surprising for me, but it is organic to the kind of the research as it developed.
You talk in the book about, within the context of Dark Agoras, the power of this illicit world of sexual and economic underground. You use the term Black queer urbanism. Explain that, for the audience.
Yeah, I think I wanted to, I think especially because I started in thinking with this project about the 1980s, I want to distinguish the kind of urbanism that I was talking about from the vantage of the underground and the set apart and the relationship and the ethics and the values that are produced within those worlds, as opposed to some of the kind of more mainstream politics that emerge in a particular mode with Black leadership after the 1980s, that I think uses the kind of the symbolic and other kind of accoutrement of Black placemaking to justify powerful transformations in the urban landscape that ultimately displace Black communities. I wanted to distinguish though. I wanted to use queer to qualify, and in that I wanted to think about trajectories, life schedules, and all of that are really out of sync with a movement from, say, in the kind of frame of dominant urbanists, from a kind of, from living in a slum to living in a suburban or suburban-like space, to really honor these paths of departure from that formulation. And I think I use, building out from Black queer and Black feminist theorists, really thinking about queer as non-normative more than simply as related to kind of questions of sex with whom or sexuality. Yeah.
No, it's in that sense, when you talk about Black queer urbanism, right, it feels like it's not even just a question of Black queer space, it's a question of Black queer time, right? It's a question of Black queer logic, and how all of that is almost diametrically opposed to this more structured reality that was not life-serving and world-making, for any Black people, let alone, Black queer folks. You when you talk about, Black queer urbanism, you mention your debt, obviously, to the work of Kathy Cohen, and her groundbreaking work from more than 20 years ago. Who were some of the other important interlocutors for you as you did this work?
Yeah, I think I really draw on Black feminist writers. I mentioned Eula Taylor earlier,
Mhm.
Sarah Haley, LaShawn Harris. These are, I think there's a classic essay from, I think, the early 2000s from Sharon Harley about Black women on the underground. As well as I would say, Black and Africana religion studies who have been, engaged with
Mhm.
questions of the set apart and taking those worlds very seriously since Arthur Hugh Fawcett's 1944 Gaza, Black Gaza the Metropolis, but with Judith Weisenfeld and other folks more recently really engaging in a serious way beyond these formulations. So I think those are the kind of interlocutors that I've been engaging with, and that kind of inhabit and kind of infuse Black queer urbanism with what it precisely means in relation to the epistemologies and modes of placemaking that are embedded within dark agoras and that could be theorized out from dark agoras. I think again, and I think those folks have been, that Harley essay, for example, points to the fact that Odessa Madre, one of the kind of queen pins of earlier 20th century Washington, D.C., is funding the NAACP. So we get from Black feminists the ways that these dense worlds that are often just labeled as slums have all of these complicated
Yeah.
trajectories and lineages within them. And I'm just trying to build out from that really theoretically and methodologically.
You closed the book by talking about MOVE. And there's been a lot written about MOVE. There've been a lot of documentaries about MOVE. It is in many ways a signature moment in late 20th century Black urban life, right? The bombing of a Black neighborhood by a Black mayor.
When Good was elected, he was praised as the role model of the new Black politician, the skilled professional, the highly trained executive who could manage a city, Black or white.
And I intend to be the mayor of all the people in the city.
His decision to authorize a police bombing of the radical Black organization MOVE touched off a firestorm which leveled 61 homes, killing 6 adults and 5 children. His own commission blamed Good and his aides.
It goes against all the logic of what the civil rights movement had suggested would be an endgame, for this political moment. Why was it important for you to re-engage MOVE in the context of Dark Agoras?
Yeah, MOVE was an organization that was founded around 1972 in Philadelphia, and that really confronted markets, police, and the kind of developmental orientation of the city's infrastructure as death dealing in relation to Black communities. They were a radical abolitionist organization that from very early on did not seek to kind of negotiate their innocence vis-a-vis the state as a means of getting free, but just held that the state should free them. They were considered radical naturalists because they believe that their house on Powhatan Avenue first, and then at Osage Avenue leading up to the 1985 MOVE bombing a move by the police department. They were doing stuff like composting and other things that brought them into to conflict with the city around sanitation. They were their name is not an acronym. They were literally to embody action. I wanted to engage with MOVE as coming out of a trajectory, rather than as a kind of aberration defined necessarily just by the kind of repressive violence of the state. And I really engaged mostly with MOVE up through 81 with the trial of John Africa. John Africa was also known as John Lephart, was the founder of MOVE, based in Powhatan Village and from that neighborhood, and also a Korean War veteran, which I think is critical to understanding the kind of theology that he espoused. His followers believe that they didn't believe that he was a second coming or anything like that. Some of the earlier movements, like Father Divine's followers, come to that kind of understanding, but they believe that he was wise beyond his kind of formal education as not a very formally educated person. And again, he preached both radical abolition and a kind of politics around devolving the urban landscape that was in line with a kind of return to what they considered natural and a state of nature. And again, that's part of what brought them into conflict with the city. I think many folks have tried to characterize John Africa or John Lephart through a kind of charismatic power. And I think that some of that analysis is significant and important, but also it can't be understood outside of the kind of growing surveillance of police and the kind of increasing closure of MOVE from its neighbors and others that police precipitate. The MOVE 9 and other who they consider their political prisoners, as well as others, testified during the 81 trial, according to their beliefs, more than necessarily defending their innocence or some other thing that you might go to court for. They were there to tell their truth. And I wanted to note the ways that taken outside of the kind of specificity of, illegally procured C4 dropped on them by the Philadelphia Police Department, where they fit in within a trajectory and a kind of universe of Black Philadelphia like politics. And I think, there, for example, during the 70s, I think to understand them in their full kind of facets, you have to engage that. And so, they like the Moorish Science Temple of America or the NOI or others for a time in the 70s consider a rural land, or Father Divine and them consider a rural land return. They decide, in part through pressure from police that they don't end up making that move. So I think they're the narratives of the transformation that MOVE members engage in, just in wanting to. Many often navigating the underground, like moving between different aspects of their life, as in those worlds, the way that their encounter with the MOVE rap draws them into the organization is remarkably stable from earlier 20th century ways that people are fished into other organizations that precede them. So I really wanted to highlight their specificity, but also their relationship to a longer genealogy, and to bring it into conversation with some of the stuff that started to emerge around, late 20th century transformations in urban political economy and all of that. I didn't write about the MOVE bombing head on, the 85 culmination head on. I have subsequently been writing certain side pieces to think about it in context. But I think, for example, again, if you take out, which I'm not suggesting that we should, but if you take out the kind of specific act of police detonating a bomb on the compound, the profile looks remarkably unfamiliar, even of the deaths, with young people dying in a house fire and other things. And so, again, I think that the MOVE, the bombing of MOVE, PPD's bombing of MOVE requires a specific kind of very detailed attention. And I also think that we need to write around that kind of eventful, spectacular violence in order to also think about the other kind of trajectories that MOVE reveals.
The thing I love about, your explanation of the formation of MOVE right there, founded in 1972, it's the same year that Philadelphia International Records launches. And in many ways, MOVE becomes a kind of literal dark counterpoint to this aspirational politics that we get all throughout the music of Gamble and Huff in the 1970s. So it is an interesting kind of counterpoint, particularly centered right there in the city of Philadelphia.
Thank you for that insight. I hadn't thought about that kind of coincided date in that way, but it's true. I mean, I think about, and also some of the kind of, the moments of certain performances within that have a certain pessimistic outlook about what's happening as well. So definitely all in the culture. So
I'm immediately hearing, Billy Paul, am I Black enough for you? Right within that context.
Indeed.
More of a speculative question for you. This is a book that you completed as we all were in the midst of living through COVID. And there's been a dramatic change to urban life, generally speaking, who comes into the city, who works in the city, who lives in the city, all those kinds of things, post-COVID. Where do you see the formation of dark agoras, if you can respond to this in this post-COVID moment?
Yeah, I think after 2008, I would sort of periodize that the kind of growth of real estate investment trusts and other major financial instruments in terms of real estate have started to precipitate up to the COVID pandemic. The increasingly rapid displacement of these kinds of worlds through the kind of clear ongoing lies of urban renewal come gentrification. And so I think dark agoras are still the kind of worlds that I engage in. This are still very much alive in Philadelphia and other places as well. And I think it begs the question of how we engage them. For me, like, how do we think about these in relation to these kinds of worlds in relation to both organized movements against stuff like gentrification, but also, I guess, how we might have and think about a different relationship with them that's not that doesn't just reject them, if we're really about the kind of various means and approaches to holding on to urban contexts and neighborhoods that have been Black worlds. I think they're very much still alive. And it is a question about how we will engage those worlds, especially moving forward, in the kind of, I think, the pause that happened with certain kinds of transformation because of the pandemic, but the ongoing kind of speculative real estate context that is still, poised to and desires to rapidly transform urban neighborhoods.
What's next for you, Professor Roane?
That's a good question. I'm working on a couple of things. I'm really seriously engaged right now in research for an intellectual biography of June Jordan, and really thinking about out from Jordan's drafted but unpublished pamphlet into a novel called OK Now, centering land reform in Mississippi. I'm also working on something that's a bit more memoirish in relation to place and my home community in Virginia, engaging questions around nostalgia and place, and loss, but also, in relation to matters of ecology. So those are the things that I'm working on going forward.
On a personal note, JT, I was fortunate to publish an essay of yours, New Black Men in Exile, got to be 6 or 7 years ago. And I mean, you were a grad student at the time, right? And I remember reading it and going that, this is both incredible writing and incredible ideas. And of course, it's all come together, in this wonderful book of yours, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place. Again, MacArthur genius Imani Perry writes of Dark Agoras. Most of all, Dark Agoras is a stunning story of insurgent world making that will have a significant impact on the world of ideas. J.T. Roane is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Geography and the Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He is currently a visiting scholar in the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Roane.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.